Hello, Jim. Tell me about your background.
Right, I was born on the 9th of November 1940 at number 6 Sparch Hollow. My mother told me it was a Saturday afternoon and there was a thunderstorm, and shortly after I was born the Germans dropped a bomb, I believe, on Shelton Bar. Now that's what she told me. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I continued to live there, and some of the early memories I have, I can particularly remember seeing a Spitfire flying over. But I wasn't quite 5 when the war ended, and I remember standing in my parents' bedroom with my parents and my sister and watching what appeared to be hundreds and hundreds of planes flying overhead. On mentioning that to my father many moons later, he told me there were only 2, but at least I had remembered seeing the planes. We had a very happy childhood, me and my sister. My parents had standards and they set the standards, and as long as you stayed within the standards, you were okay. My father worked in the pottery industry. My mother was purely and simply a housewife. My father was also secretary of the Newcastle branch of the National Association of Pottery Workers, and he had a lot to do with the union in that time. Sparch Hollow is exactly the same as it was then, but Harry Ball's farm, which we used to play in, and he used to chase us with his shotgun, and I mean that, he used to chase us with his shotgun. Harry Ball's farm has now been replaced by Merrifield Special School and the Peter Pan Nursery, but all the grounds surrounding those 2 buildings that were part of Harry Ball's farm are still there. The farmhouse was ancient and old with typical stone flag floors. It was 3 sides of a courtyard, and the stables were attached. He kept cows and he kept pigs, and he also kept chickens. The toilets originally were outside and was known as a double toilet. In the fact you walked into this room, there was a wooden plank with 2 holes in, and that was the original toilet. There was a stream running on the southern end of his property which still flows today, and that is the Lime Brook. A lot of people think the Lime Brook starts in Silverdale. It doesn't. It starts in the Milehouse area. As I say, we used to get chased by Harry, particularly if you went into his field, and we used to go and dam the stream up and play with boats, and I remember once falling in, and it was not a pleasant experience. And Harry was quite a character, and the fact that every day at 12 o'clock he would get on his bike and cycle to the Bear Inn in the West Brampton, have his 3 or 4 pints, cycle back, and then he'd take his horse out in the afternoon delivering milk. And on occasions, if the horse didn't know where to stop, people didn't get the milk delivered. Our parents took us out. We didn't have a car, but we used to go out, and they took us all over the place in North Staffordshire. As I say, we had a very, very happy childhood, and I remember in 1945 going to Prestatyn with my mother, my sister, and an aunt and her 2 children on holiday. And my father and my uncle couldn't come because the war was still on. And in 1946, I also remember going to Abergele, and many, many years later, while staying in the area, I went to Abergele and found the house where we stayed, and it's called Urswick House.
Tell me about your school days.
Right, I started at Maybank Infants in September 1945 when I was about 4 3/4. It was about a half a mile walk, and we had to cross the main road in Maybank. I can remember one of the teachers' names was Miss Ship, and I was there from 1945 until 48. And in those days, the old air raid shelters were there with the concrete roofs, but they were not open to children. But occasionally we would wander through in the pitch dark. The building was quite unusual, as I remember, for a school, and it's still there. You went in through the main door and you immediately went into the hall, and all the classrooms were ringed around the three sides, and of course there were outside toilets. Now, the majority of children from Maybank Infants went either to the church school in Woolstanton or Ellison Street School. I was different. For some unknown reason, my best friend went to Hassel Street, and I decided that I wanted to go to Hassel Street. So in 1948, I enrolled at Hassel Street School, where I spent 4 years. That is a typical Victorian school. It's still open. And I also remember on one occasion they installed some gymnastics equipment in the hall, which I was asked to sort of stand by and help as required. And many years later, when both my children went to Hassel Street School, that equipment was still there. I did, as I say, 4 years, and in the final year I was the school goalkeeper. Not that I was much good, but I was the school goalkeeper. I took my 11 plus at the Orme School in 1952, and fortunate was able to pass it. Now, for some unknown reason, my father would not allow me to go to Woolstanton Grammar School, the entrance of which was only about 150 yards from where we lived, and he insisted that I went to Newcastle High School. And as a dutiful son in the 1950s, I did as I was asked and never asked the question, why? Newcastle High School was a very old school. I think it started in 1872, and one of my first impressions on starting there was, my word, some of the pupils are men. And what I didn't realise, that in the sixth form they could be 17 or 18, so even as a young 10 and 11-year-old they were men. I was not a brilliant academic scholar, probably reasonably average, and I was always in the B stream. One of my favourite lessons was Latin. I absolutely adored Latin, but unfortunately in the final year when we were taking our O-levels, we had a Latin teacher who insisted that you gave 120%, and I lost interest in Latin. I took the Oxford and Cambridge GEC, as it was called in those days, and had the wonderful distinction of passing in English literature and geography. And my father at that time said, "You're wasting your time at that school. There's a clerking job with the coal board. You're leaving school, get an apply." And I did as he told me, and I actually got a job with the National Coal Board in 1957.
What was it like, your first experience of work?
I was interviewed by the National Coal Board at the area headquarters in Stoke-on-Trent, and was offered a post in the manager's clerk's office at Hemheath at Trentham. And that involved, in those days, cycling, because you couldn't get a bus from Newcastle to Hemheath. You could get one to Trentham, but you had to walk about 1.5 miles up the road. So I used to cycle. I had a sheltered upbringing. My parents didn't drink. They were quiet, and they sort of protected us from the big bad world. And one of the things that I was immediately struck when I started at the pit was a group of what I called, excuse the expression, hairy-arsed miners who used every swear word in the book that I had never even heard of. That was a shock. A complete shock, because it was totally alien to everything I'd been brought up. But I soon realised that that was their way of life, and I also understand that in some respects it was the way of life in the pottery industry as well. But over the years, I soon began to have total and utter respect and finally come to the conclusion that the North Staffordshire miners were the finest breed of men I've ever been privileged to know. I started in the manager's clerk's office, and it was generally making tea and filing and sitting at a typewriter using two hands. The men used to come in on a Friday to talk to the manager about the wages, because in those days they were on contracts, and sometimes if they didn't if they didn't do the required amount of work, they obviously didn't get paid. It was a wonderful experience, probably the best part of my working life, despite the fact what I've already said. In 1961, I was invited to the area office in Stoke-on-Trent to apply for a job to work in the office of the area production manager. And I remember walking into the boardroom at 72 Leek Road with a chap called Ken Eardley, who I eventually went to work for, and a man from staff department called Mance Hurd. And the first question Ken Eardley asked me was, "If you get the job, will you take your beard off?" And I said no, and I didn't get the job. 12 months later, I got another telephone call, by which time I had met my wife and I'd taken my beard off, and I was interviewed again by the same two people and actually got the job, and was told, had you have taken your beard off 12 months before, you would have got the job. So I worked in the office of the area production manager, and in those days there were 21 working pits in North Staffordshire, and Mr. Wilcox was well, let's say he had a way that not many people had. He was a brusque individual. He used a lot of swear words, but you got a lot of respect in working for him. And I had a wonderful time there. And one of the many jobs I had to do, every afternoon I had to ring every colliery in the area, and as I say, there were 21 of them, to obtain the outputs of tonnage. And that went on till about 1964, when a job came up at Sneed Colliery, and in those days a manager called a group manager was responsible for a number of collieries. And by a strange coincidence, the group manager who I eventually went to work for at Sneed Colliery was a chap called Evan Maudsley. He was the manager at Hemheath. He got promoted to group manager, and I then went to work for him at Sneed. And as I say, he was responsible for Woolstanton Colliery, which by then had merged with Deep Pit and Sneed, and he was also responsible for Fenton Colliery and for Foxfield Colliery, which was the last colliery in the Cheadle coalfield. And I did on one occasion visit Foxfield Colliery. No buses, I had to go by colliery van. I then spent 6 months with another group manager called Frank Ball at Stafford Colliery, which is now, if you know where the southeast stand of the Bet 635 Stadium is, well, that sits directly over the shafts of Stafford Colliery, and he was responsible for Stafford and Hemheath. And after, let me get this right, after 6 months there, I went back to number 72 Leek Road, again to work for Ken Eardley. And in 1966, we moved to a brand new office block on the site of the former Berry Hill Colliery, which was the number 1 North Staffordshire area headquarters. And I was in the secretary's department, and we were responsible, amongst other things, for the typing pool, the switchboard, mail room, chauffeurs, colliery visits ad nauseum. And I remained there until 1989.
Can we go back to your memories of Silverdale?
My memories of Silverdale go back to the late 1940s, shortly before my brother was born. My brother was born in 1950. And what used to happen, as I said to you earlier, we used to go a lot of places. My parents didn't have a car, so I do remember walking into Newcastle, catching the bus to Silverdale. Don't really remember too much about it. I remember the almshouses, I remember the church, and bear in mind this is before Parkside was built, but Silverdale House, the home of Lord Cadman, originally was still standing there, and that later, I understand, became Parkside Working Men's Club, and it's recently been demolished. What we would do, we would walk from Silverdale through to Keele. We would then walk from Keele to Whitmore and catch the bus back to Newcastle. On other occasions, when my brother was born, we would do it in the reverse order. So my earliest memories of Silverdale are basically passing through. But when I started train spotting at Madeley in the early 1950s, we never used to like going up Keele Bank. So we always went through Silverdale and also we went through Leaseat as well. And I well remember all the streets and the houses. I mean, a lot of the houses that I remember have been demolished. I also remember where Crown Street Halt was. I also remember the whole of Silverdale Station. And I do remember they used to run trains from Silverdale to Wedgwood for the pottery workers. And there was one occasion, I think it was in the 50s or early 60s, where a young girl of 16 was standing on the platform and she actually fell onto the track and had both legs taken off by the train. That's not fantasy, I believe that is true. Later in life, this again would be the late 50s, a friend of mine became a local preacher in the Methodist circuit, and in those days there were 4 Methodist churches in Silverdale, and I used to accompany him, and we visited every single Methodist church in Silverdale.
Tell me about meeting your wife.
In the 1950s, as I mentioned, I used to go out with a friend who became a Methodist local preacher. And one Sunday afternoon, he came out of the schoolrooms in Merrill Street opposite the police station, being chased by what I can only describe as a gorgeous ginger-headed lady. And I thought, I've got to get to know her. And by a strange coincidence, 12 to 15 months later, we started courting. Her name was Audrey. Her father was Welsh. She got the most sparkling blue eyes you could ever wish anybody to have. And her hair was the colour of burnished gold. A lot of people didn't understand our relationship because in 1960, I was 20 and she was 25. That made no difference whatsoever to us. And within 2 years of going out, we were married, and within 3 years we'd got 2 children. She was an absolutely lovely person. She worked at the Michelin until our son was born, and then she became a full-time housewife, but she used to work on the cheese stall in the market on a Friday and a Saturday, and she did that for many years. She never ever had to raise a voice. She'd only got to look not only at the children, but also at me. And that was her way of exercising control. Is not the right way. She didn't have to shout or scream. She didn't have to threaten anybody. She just looked at them, and she was loved and respected for that. Our children eventually married, and my son has now got 2 grandsons and 2 granddaughters, which makes me a great granddad. My daughter married and she had horrendous problems and gave birth to twins, one of whom was stillborn, and my youngest grandson will be 18 on the 27th of October, and that's very poignant. It's bittersweet. Christmas and birthdays are bittersweet because you think, what would it have been had Lucy been alive? The reason I say that the 27th of October is poignant is that 4 years ago, my wife was diagnosed with stage 4 terminal lung cancer and died within 90 days. The Dougie Mac came in and they were absolutely fabulous, and I had people stopping overnight, which meant I could go to bed. And the Dougie Mac always said she wouldn't die on the 27th of October. And we said, why? She said that she won't. She'll either die before or she'll die after. And on the 27th of October 2012 at 11 o'clock in the morning, she blew 14 candles out in one go. And 24 hours and 13 minutes later, she died. And I don't know why this happened, but my son and all his family, including the great-granddaughter, turned up. I had to ring my daughter because she'd been with us the night before. She turned up, and we were all with her when she died. My grandson and his dad arrived 10 minutes later. I remember then, when she'd been taken away, I went to my daughter's and we all met up that night, and we went to Rare in Newcastle and we all had a meal. She was a lovely, lovely person, loved and respected by many, many people. And when her funeral was held, they were absolutely standing in the aisles out of love and respect for her.
Tell me about your health.
In 1993, I think it was Christmas Eve, I had a massive, massive hemorrhage and did nothing about it because my father was seriously ill. I remember going out on Christmas Day with the family as if nothing had happened, and at the end of January 1994 I had another massive hemorrhage, by which time my father was even worse, and he died about 10 days later in early February. I remember going to the funeral thinking what will happen, but it didn't. And towards August I had another slight hemorrhage and decided I ought to do something about it. To cut a very long story short, I went to the hospital in November 1994. It was the 30th of November, and was diagnosed with cancer of the bowel, and was told, go away, enjoy Christmas, and we'll have you in January and sort you out. And I duly went in January 1995. The operation was a complete and utter success, but within 7 or 8 days I began to feel what I can only describe as very ropey. The nurses were absolutely fantastic, and on the Saturday afternoon, Professor Alder, who was the duty surgeon, walked into the ward with a group of trainee doctors. He took one look at me and put the back of his hand on my forehead and the back of his hand on my nose and asked the people why he'd done it. Blank stares. He says that's one of the most important things in medicine. It's known as the puppy test. Puppies with warm noses are ill. Humans with cold noses are ill. This young man, I was 54 at the time, is icy cold. He's desperately ill. I remember my sister coming. I remember my wife coming. The next thing I remember was being prepared for theatre, and somebody said, Jim, when you wake up, you'll have a colostomy. I don't know whether I said it or thought it, but the words through my mind was, you can cut me effing head off as far as I'm concerned. The next thing I remember is walking down this corridor to a door, and I opened the door and there was a most wonderful, soft, comforting light. And the voice said, go back, Jim, I'm not ready for you yet. I closed the door, turned round and woke up in intensive care. Now I know I met God that afternoon and he sent me back. I'm not a religious person, never have been, but I met him and he sent me back. What surprised me was my friends, and I'm laughing now, I'm telling you, because what they wanted to know, had he got horns, a trident and a forked tail, and no he hadn't. And I have still got a colostomy to this day, 21 years later.
Can you continue with that, Jim, please?
Yeah. When the North Staffs Royal Infirmary in Hartshill was closing, funding was obtained, and it was led by a chap called Ian Lawley, who strangely enough lives 3 doors away from me. He used to be the head of the museum in Hanley, and it was called If Wards Could Talk. Now, not only did they publish a book with photographs, but they also interviewed people, and I was interviewed by Ian, and the story I have just told you about Professor Elder is actually on record, and an official DVD has been issued. The strange thing about Professor Elder is that I still see him. His daughter has a house in my street, and I remember seeing him in Newcastle about 3 to 4 years after I came out of hospital, and I introduced myself to him and told him what he'd done. He says, "Oh yes," he says, "I remember." He says, "You got peritonitis, young man." And to this day, every time I see him, I thank him, because if he hadn't come onto that ward at that time, I would not have been here talking today.
We're backtracking a little bit now, Jim, but can you tell me about the Coal Board?
Well, I finished with the National Coal Board, or it was British Coal then, in April 1989 at the grand old age of 48 and a half. Thanks to my friend, who if I saw her I would absolutely shoot her, Mrs. Thatcher. Not only did she destroy my industry, she enabled me to retire at the grand old age of 48 and a half in the full knowledge of my National Coal pension. And I do remember going to my father and thanking him for taking me out of school in 1957 and saying that I might not need to work again after the age of 50. And he couldn't understand that, because he'd started work at the age of 10 and finished at 65. I then got a job at Chatley Whitfield Mining Museum. Now, when Chatley Whitfield was being set up in 1974-5, I was on the working party that actually set Chatley Whitfield Mining Museum up. I was also at the Coal Board. If Chatley Whitfield wanted anything, it was me they came to initially. So I started off at Chatley Whitfield in June, 3 months after I'd retired, 1989, and was eventually made the last curator. And that is what brought me into contact with the miners of North Staffordshire. It didn't matter whether they were locally born and bred, Poles, Ukrainians, Welshmen, Scotsmen, Yorkshiremen. They were the finest breed of men I've ever been privileged to know. And I do remember one of the greatest compliments that was ever made to me was by one of the chaps. He was a guide, and he was in hospital, and on my way home from work I had to go and see him to take him some stuff. And one of the things he said to me was, "Dost know why we get on so well with they, kid?" I said, "No, Danny." He says, "Because they speaks our language." And that to me was a fantastic compliment. And I used to go down every morning around about 11 o'clock to have a cup of tea with them. But unfortunately, the mining museum, for reasons I won't go into, closed on the 9th of August 1993, and I, along with a lot of other people, were made redundant. One other thing which is very interesting is that I still go to Chatley Whitfield, which I may talk about later. I was then on the dole for 12 months, and then I got a job as a lollipop man, and I started in September 1993, which is a poignant date, because on the 30th of November that year I was diagnosed with cancer of the bowel, as I've already said, and I ceased being a lollipop man in December 1993, and I've never worked since.
Okay, Jim, can you now tell us about your life since you retired?
Yeah, as I said, that I finished at Chatley Whitfield in 1993, and was diagnosed with cancer of the bowel in 1994, and I actually didn't realise how ill I was, and I'm told I was ill, and I now accept that I was, and I went through 30 weeks of chemotherapy every Wednesday for 30 weeks, apart from 2 weeks when I was too ill to have it. It wasn't invasive, and I didn't lose any hair, thank goodness. It would have made me look even worse than I look now. It took a long time to get over it, and I virtually, to say I did nothing for 5 years is not strictly true, but I was under the hospital until the year 2000, and I would go initially every 3 months, then every 6 months, and then every 12 months. And I'm going to tell this story because I tell it to everybody and I think it's funny. Every time I went, you had the finger up the bum. Every single time. And I remember going one time and there was this giant of a West Indian with fingers like tree trunks. And he did actually say to me, right, Jim, time for the examination. So you're in a fetal position facing the wall. And I actually got off the couch as he was taking gloves off his fingers. And I said, thank God for that. He says, why? I said, well, to see you taking gloves off your fingers. He says, well, I have to put gloves on. I said, I know you do, but when you're in a fetal position facing a wall, what you might think be gloves going on to fingers could be something else going on to somewhere else. And he laughed so much he fell off his chair. My wife said, you're totally and utterly disgusting. So it took me quite some time. And I was finally diagnosed, I was finally discharged in 1990 as in remission. And 16 years later, I am still in remission. And it was then that I decided that I ought to put something back for the fantastic help and assistance I'd had from the health service, because no matter what you hear about the health service, when you need it, they're absolutely phenomenal. And I still go today every 12 months for a checkup by my doctor, and they've not let me go. So one of the first things I started to do was to go back to Chatterley Whitfield, because it had been closed, but the person who in 1974 had decided that there was going to be a mining museum used to go one day a week with old Sid. And when Sid retired in 2004, he'd done 68 years at Chatterley Whitfield. And there was a chap called Dick Hazard, and he was Lord of the Manor of Milford. But he was the black sheep of the family, and his brother actually ran the estate. And Dick turned out to be a ventilation officer at various collieries in North Staffordshire, and he was the ventilation officer up at Chatterley Whitfield. And we had an absolutely fantastic time. And at that time, there was a move afoot to set up the Friends of Chatterley Whitfield, and I became a founder member, and I was chairman for many, many years. And in 2016, I still go back to Chatterley Whitfield every Thursday, and I now take my dog with me. I also joined Newcastle-under-Lyme Civic Society, and within about 12 months, I was made chairman, a post I occupied for probably 8 or 9 years. And the Civic Society was set up to preserve and protect the buildings of Newcastle-under-Lyme, and it was set up not after the demolition of the Municipal Hall, as a lot of people think. It was actually set up following the demolition, apart from the facade, of the Castle Hotel. And we're still as proactive in the town today. I also joined various other committees on the Borough Council, and was chairman of those as well. I also became a member of Apedale Heritage Centre, Moseley Railway Trust, Foxfield Railway and the Churnet Valley Railway, which I visit as often as I possibly can. And I've lived a very full life. And in fact, looking at my diary this week, I am now fully occupied all the way through until Saturday. And it's something that I like. I've got to keep on the go. I can't sit and do nothing. It's usually about 4 o'clock at night when I decide, right, that's it for the day. When my wife died, or in the run-up to my wife dying in 2012, I dropped off quite a lot of committees. But soon after she died, I started to go back again, and I'm probably now on at least 4 or 5 committees, which keeps me occupied and stops me from falling asleep, which I tend to do if I sit down too often, particularly in an afternoon.
Okay, Jim. Can you give us any further reflections that you've got on Silverdale Village, please?
The earliest record of coal mining in North Staffordshire is in the manorial court rolls of Tunstall in 1282, where mining was taking place on the ridge Bemersley at the back of the present Chatley Whitfield Colliery. It was a late developer because North Staffordshire was always as a backwater until the coming of the M6 and the electric trains to London and Manchester. But it developed over the years into perhaps one of the most important coal fields in Great Britain, because it was the only coal field that had every quality of coal in one area compared to the others, and the only types of coal that it didn't have was anthracite, which is basically South Wales, and brown coal or lignite, and the only known coal mine that did that was at Brora, midway between Inverness and Wick, and by a strange coincidence it was owned and operated by the Duke of Sutherland from Trentham Hall. Why am I waxing lyrical about the coal mining industry? Well, if you hadn't have had the right quality of coal in North Staffordshire, you wouldn't have had a pottery industry, because it takes 5 tons of coal to produce 1 ton, 5 tons of coal to fire 1 ton of clay. The majority of clay in North Staffordshire, particularly in the Silverdale area, was marl, brown clay. The China clay is basically in the West Country, and the China clay has been brought to North Staffordshire from the West Country for over 300 years. The Silverdale Company was founded in 1792. So if you look on Yates's map of 1775, you won't see Silverdale. You'll see Keele, you'll see Nutton, you'll see Leaseat, you'll see All Sages Bank, you'll see Black Bank, but you won't see Silverdale, because Silverdale as a village didn't exist. And the village of Silverdale came about directly before the colliery, because of the colliery, and I understand it was about the 1820s or the 1830s. Now, I have a photograph at home. It's actually taken from a calendar, and it's a painting held in Newcastle Museum at the Brampton of Silverdale in the 1860s, and all you can see on the left hand side is the coal workings, the coal shafts and buildings, with a huge St Luke's Church in the middle, with 1 or 2 very small buildings on the left of the church. So again, Silverdale developed around the church, and it grew into quite a large and important business. And the pit actually was scheduled for closure in the late 60s, early 70s, until a chap called John Belcher went from Stafford Colliery to become the colliery manager, and he realised the potential and persuaded the powers that be that although it was a very old colliery with shallow shafts, there was a new coal field down to the south. And initially they sank a 1 in 4 drift, which not only connected up with the current mine workings, and then plans were developed to sink a further 2 drifts and another drift, and the existing drift down to 2,800 yards in length, and they terminated roughly under the motorway service station at Keele. And from there on in, they developed a brand new coal mine, and it became one of the most productive in North Staffordshire, and it produced 1 million tonnes of coal in 1 year with about 630 men. And when you realise that in 1936 Chatley Whitfield became the first coal mine in North Staffordshire, possibly Great Britain, to produce 1 million saleable tonnes of coal, and they got a manpower of 4,200. As I said, Silverdale was a highly productive colliery, and then following the miners' strike, the industry dive bombed, and Silverdale became the last deep mine in North Staffordshire to operate, and it closed on the 31st of December 1998. leaving the Drift Mine Underground Mining Museum at Apedale as the only place where you can actually go to see original coal working. So Silverdale is important. Its life lasted from 1792 to 1998. But there's a problem with Silverdale in the fact that in the early years they mined ironstone. And during these years as operation of a colliery, they had severe problems with mine water, which was discharged into the Silverdale Brook, which became orange. So a couple of chaps from the coal preparation department actually devised a scheme where the water was put through a coal preparation technique and the ochre was leached out round a drum, which was then carted off for disposal on the tip, and clean water was discharged to the stream. Now when the pit shut, that remained a problem. So 17 shaft remains open to this day. It has a submersible pump and only pumps water when the water reaches a certain level. But they couldn't pump it directly to the stream because of its colour and iron content. So now it goes through a cascade, it goes through a settling pond, it goes through a reed bed, and then it is discharged to the Silverdale Brook as clean water. If you come to the traffic lights at Silverdale, where you've got Garner's Garden Centre, and go towards Newcastle, you'll notice on the left hand side a Severn Trent pumping station. That was put there for a specific region because I am told that the area of that part of Silverdale has sunk by 11 feet due to mining subsidence, which meant that the Silverdale Brook, being 1.5 miles from the dam at Poole Dam, had only got a fall of 18 inches and it flooded quite frequently. So at your expense and my expense, the National Coal Board put in a pumping station which ensured that the water was pumped and it didn't flood, and I believe that that pumping station is still in operation today.